White America has been poisoning black people for decades and has been hiding it from us. What I'm about to tell you will make your blood boil. For over a century, the United States government has deliberately used black bodies as test subjects for chemical weapons, radiation experiments, and biological warfare. They've targeted our children, destroyed our families, covered up their crimes for generations. Summer 1953, St. Louis, Missouri. 8-year-old Ben Phillips is playing in his neighborhood when men in hazmat suits appear on the rooftops above him. They start spraying a mysterious mist that falls down on the children below. The government told families it was harmless. They lied. What they were really doing was testing radioactive chemical weapons on black children. And when people started dying, they buried the evidence and silenced the survivors. Today, the survivors of these experiments are still alive. Ben Phillips is now 73 years old, and Chester Deans, 75. Both men have spent the last 30 years fighting for one thing: justice. For decades, white America has dismissed them as conspiracy theorists, denied their claims, ignored their suffering. The government that poisoned them as children still refuses to pay for what they did. What they experienced as children in St. Louis changed their lives forever. Their families were destroyed, their health was ruined, their trust in America was shattered. But the true evil of these experiments goes deeper than anyone imagined. This isn't just about chemical weapons testing. This is about environmental racism as government policy. This is about white America's systematic plan to destroy black communities through poison. St. Louis, Missouri, 1950s. The Pruitt-Igoe housing project stretched across 57 acres of North St. Louis. 33 high-rise apartment buildings, home to thousands of black families trying to build better lives in post-war America. By 1953, 75% of Pruitt-Igoe residents were black. That wasn't a coincidence. Army documents from that period reveal how military planners viewed these American families. They called Pruitt-Igoe a densely populated slum district, perfect for their purposes. The targeting was deliberate, calculated, racist. These people had no idea they were about to become human guinea pigs in one of the most evil experiments in American history. But why did the military need to test something on American families? What could possibly require using children as test subjects? The Army story was simple. They were testing defensive smoke screens to protect American cities from potential Soviet chemical attacks. Cold War paranoia was at its peak, and national security justified everything. "We're keeping you safe," they said. "This is for America's protection." But from the very beginning, nothing about their story made sense. If this was really about defense, why the absolute secrecy? Why weren't community leaders informed? Why weren't residents given any choice in the matter? If the chemicals were truly harmless, why did Army personnel wear full hazmat suits while families below had no protection at all? If this was national defense, why choose poor black neighborhoods? Wouldn't affluent white communities be more likely targets in an actual attack? If this was just testing smoke dispersal, why continue the experiments for over a decade? Every detail of their cover story crumbles under scrutiny. The truth is, they weren't testing defensive measures. They weren't protecting America. They were developing weapons of mass destruction, and they needed to know how those weapons would work on human beings. What were they really trying to accomplish? The declassified documents reveal a much darker truth. The classified operation had a name: Large Area Coverage. The goal? Developing offensive chemical weapons for urban warfare. The Army wasn't testing smoke screens. They were learning how to poison entire cities. The chemical compound they chose, zinc cadmium sulfide, was already known to cause cancer, kidney damage, and lung disease. Military researchers had studied its toxic effects at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah years earlier, but they needed real-world data. They needed to know how chemical agents would spread through dense urban areas, how wind patterns would affect concentration levels, how long toxic particles will remain in the air that families breathe. Declassified documents reveal the cold scientific language military planners used. They didn't refer to residents as people, as citizens, as human beings. They called them the population, lab rats in a massive experiment. Between 1953 and 1965, the Army conducted aerosol dispersal tests in 33 American cities: Minneapolis, Corpus Christi, Oceanside, California, but St. Louis received the most intensive treatment. Over 70 separate test days across 12 years, the concentration of toxic exposure was unlike anything they inflicted on other communities. Why? The targeting logic was simple. They chose communities with no political power, no media attention, no ability to demand accountability. Black families were considered expendable for military research. The residents of Pruitt-Igoe had no idea that their government viewed them as less than human. But what researchers discovered next would expose the true horror of these experiments. Army contracts from the 1950s showed purchases from the U.S. Radium Corporation. The military had ordered luminous compounds for atmospheric testing in urban environments. The chemicals weren't just toxic, they were radioactive. The zinc-cadmium sulfide sprayed over Pruitt-Igoe had been deliberately mixed with radioactive particles, radium-226 and thorium-232. The Army needed to track how their poison spread through the community, so they added radiation to make the particles glow under detection equipment. They weren't just testing chemical weapons on black children, they were irradiating them. For over a decade, families were exposed to a double dose of poison, toxic chemicals that could cause cancer, mixed with radioactive particles that guaranteed it. This was always the plan. The men in hazmat suits knew exactly what they were doing. They protected themselves while deliberately poisoning the families below. This was environmental racism as government policy. The consequences would destroy families for generations. Ben Phillips watched his family disintegrate, piece by piece. His mother developed lung cancer in her 30s. She had never smoked, had no family history of cancer, no explanation for why her body was destroying itself. She died at 42, leaving Ben to wonder what had killed the woman who raised him. His sister began having seizures at age 12. Doctors couldn't explain the neurological damage. She suffered from epilepsy for the rest of her short life, dying at 29 from complications no one could understand. Ben himself lost hearing in one ear due to a brain tumor. A healthy young man suddenly dealing with growths in his skull that medical experts couldn't explain. Chester Deans watched his younger brother struggle with breathing problems from childhood, chronic respiratory distress that got worse each year. His brother died of heart failure at 34, his lungs too damaged to keep his heart functioning. Across Pruitt-Igoe, the same patterns emerged. Cancer rates spiked. Children developed mysterious breathing problems. Families buried their loved ones without understanding why. Dr. Doris Spates, who worked at Homer G. Phillips Hospital during the 1950s, documented the crisis in her medical records. Emergency room visits for respiratory problems increased 45% during active testing periods. Pediatric cancer diagnoses were 20% higher than city averages. The community was dying, and no one could explain why. Hospital records show that doctors were baffled by the sudden health crisis. They had no idea that the government was systematically poisoning their patients. Generations of black families paid the price for white America's military research. And when people started asking questions, the government's response was predictable. The moment families began connecting the illnesses to the government testing, the lies began. Officials dismissed sick families as complainers and troublemakers. They told grieving parents that their children's cancers were just bad luck. They assured worried mothers that the government would never do anything to hurt American families. Documents that could prove the connection mysteriously disappeared from government files. Evidence was accidentally destroyed. Records were lost in bureaucratic reshuffling. When the truth finally started emerging in the 1990s, the Army's response was to investigate itself. They commissioned their own health study, carefully designed to reach predetermined conclusions. The 1997 Army report concluded that zinc-cadmium sulfide exposure was minimal and unlikely to cause adverse health effects. They based this on computer models without ever testing actual residents or examining medical records from the affected community. Most tellingly, the Army study completely ignored the radioactive component. They simply pretended it didn't exist. Independent researchers immediately identified the obvious flaws. The Army hadn't studied the people who were actually exposed. They hadn't accounted for childhood vulnerability. They hadn't considered cumulative effects over years of exposure. The fix was in from the beginning. The Army wasn't looking for truth. They were manufacturing a cover-up. Survivors who spoke out were labeled as conspiracy theorists. Ben Phillips and Chester Deans were dismissed as confused old men with faulty memories. Government lawyers claimed sovereign immunity, arguing that the United States cannot be sued for national security decisions made in good faith. 70 years later, there has been no compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The government that poisoned these families continues to deny responsibility, and this mentality never ended. 2014, Flint, Michigan, another majority black city. Another government decision to poison an entire community. City officials switched Flint's water supply from Detroit's treated water to the corrosive Flint River. They knew the river water would leach lead from old pipes. They knew children would be poisoned. They did it anyway to save money. When residents complained about the smell, taste, and color of their water, officials told them it was safe. When children started showing signs of lead poisoning, the government denied any connection. For years, families were told to trust the system while their children's brains were being damaged by lead exposure. The same pattern: poor black community, government lies, cover up when people got sick. The same institutions that poisoned Ben Phillips and Chester Deans in the 1950s poisoned the children of Flint in the 2010s. Environmental racism didn't end with the civil rights movement. It adapted. It evolved. It found new methods to achieve the same goals. The systematic targeting of black communities for environmental harm continues today. Cancer Alley in Louisiana surrounds black neighborhoods with chemical plants. Jackson, Mississippi has been without clean water for months. For over a century, white America has used poison as a weapon against black communities. The methods change, but the targets remain the same. Ben Phillips and Chester Deans understand they're not just fighting for compensation from one historical incident. They're fighting against a system that has always viewed black lives as expendable. The evidence is now undeniable. Declassified documents prove the government's crimes. Survivor testimonies provide the human cost. Independent research confirms the long-term health impacts. But 70 years later, justice is still denied. No compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement that black lives matter as much as white lives. This is who America really is. This is who America has always been. Remember Ben Phillips and Chester Deans, two elderly heroes who refuse to be silenced, who demand accountability, who fight for truth in the face of institutional denial. You have the power to spread this truth. Share this story with everyone you know. Subscribe to Black Stories Untold and help us expose more hidden histories that the government tried to bury forever. They tried to poison us into silence, but we will never be silenced.